Amen. Good morning, church. It's lovely to be with you guys today. I want to address something before we do anything this morning. And this is addressing a whole bunch of people. This is addressing you guys. This is addressing Cafe Church and Ellen as well. There is a tension in the room that I need to diffuse right now. I'm looking across a sea of faces. I'm looking in some eyes. I'm sure, in Ellen and in Cafe Church, the eyes are the same. And I feel it's like if I was like a young gazelle, and I'm looking in the eyes of a lion that is ready to pounce. A bunch of people here, they saw me come up, and there was a light bulb moment, and they thought, ding, I've got a joke, I've got a comment, I'm going to say it. So for the sake of everyone in the room, let's just burst that bubble. Guys, where's Wally? There we go. And the thing is, I have multiple red and white striped shirts, and every time I choose to wear it, I I look myself in the mirror and I say, hey Johnny, have you got the self-esteem to do this again? Can you deal with the comments? Can you deal with the ridicule? And then Mirror Johnny looks back at me and he says, Johnny, the Where's Wally books came out in 1987. This is an over 20-year-old reference. Surely. Without fail, consistently. I had about 10 people come up to me this morning and be like, wait. So well done to you on coming up with the joke. We're going to kill it there. I had said to Ed that I missed out on a double up that joke. I thought it would have been really funny if I'd had a word with a few people in the congregation and hidden other kind of Where's Wally characters in the crowd. But next time. Anyway, should we proceed? So we are still going on in that series in our church called Weak But Strong, which is kind of a study on 2 Corinthians, where we are talking about human weakness, but also spiritual strength. And the fact that actually, as humans, we can often be small and fragile and insignificant. But actually, the great hope that it gives us that God chooses to work so frequently through people who are small and fragile and insignificant. So today we are in 2 Corinthians 7, 2-16. And where we've gotten to in this point of the letter is that for the first 7 chapters, essentially, Paul has been going over this broken relationship between him and the church and the hurt that everyone actually has been feeling because of that. I was speaking here a bit earlier in the summer, kind of early on in that kind of stage, where Paul essentially calls out the issue and says, hey guys, we have got some problems here as a family that we have to deal with. And today, nicely, we're kind of at the end point of that, where actually Paul and the church are choosing to sew up that wound together before moving on. So what we're going to do is we're going to read the passage and we'll take things from there. So if you'd like a Bible, pop a hand in the air. I'm sure someone can run one out to you. But for everyone else, we are in 7, 2-16. Make room for us in your hearts. We have wronged no one, we have corrupted no one, we have exploited no one. I do not say this to condemn you. I have said before that you have such a place in our hearts that we would live or die with you. I have spoken to you with great frankness. I take great pride in you. I am greatly encouraged. In all our troubles, my joy knows no bounds. For when we came into Macedonia, we had no rest, but we were harassed at every turn. Conflicts on the outside, fears within. But God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus. And not only by his coming, but also by the comfort you had given him. He told us about your longing for me, your deep sorrow, your ardent concern for me, so that my joy was greater than ever. Even if I caused you sorrow by my letter, I do not regret it. Though I did regret to see that my letter hurt you, but only for a little while. Yet now I am happy, not because you were made sorry, but because your sorrow led you to repentance. For you became sorrowful as God intended, and so are not harmed in any way by us. Godly sorrow brings repentance that leads to salvation and leaves no regret. But worldly sorrow brings death. See what this godly sorrow has produced in you. What earnestness, what eagerness to clear yourselves, what indignation, what alarm, what longing, what concern, what readiness to see justice done. At every point you have proved yourself to be innocent in this matter. So even though I wrote to you, it was neither on account of the one who did the wrong, nor on account of the injured party, but rather that before God you could see for yourselves how devoted to us you are. By all this we are encouraged. And in addition to our own encouragement, we were especially delighted to see how happy Titus was, because his spirit has been refreshed by all of you. I had boasted to him about you, and you've not embarrassed me. But just as everything we said to you was true, so our boasting about you to Titus has proved to be true as well. And his affection for you is all the greater when he remembers that you were all obedient, receiving him with fear and trembling. I'm glad that I can have complete confidence in you. When I was about 4 years old, I attempted to run away from home. You don't need to worry, this is like a funny story. I can't fully remember what had happened, but I decided that I had been suitably wronged and that I was leaving because that was my only course of action. I'd probably just been told, like, wash your hands before dinner again, but I determinedly made up my mind that this was enough. I wasn't going to stand for any more of this treatment, and I'd had quite enough of my circumstance. So I packed my bags and I left. In my bag I packed a plastic action figure, presumably for like protection on the street. I packed a kind of fluffy toy dog thing, and then I believe a change of t-shirt, because you got to stay fresh, got to stay clean on the streets. But anyway, I set off out the front door, and who should pull up in a car but my father on his way home from work, which was mighty inconvenient. And we had a brief but very serious conversation where I said, Dad, I've had it up to here, I'm done. I'm going my own way. And he could tell by the kind of seriousness of my tone that I wasn't to be reasoned with. And so he just said, well, very well, and let me do my own thing. So this boy, who had decided that washing his hands too often was just too much hardship, set off down the road. I must have gotten about 2 minutes kind of down the street when I realized that actually to leave on an empty stomach would not have been a good idea. So I promptly returned home into the loving embrace of my family, had a warm meal, and forgot all about my desire to leave in the first place. But I also realized as well, I was speaking to my dad about this story recently, and he says that he was actually just around the corner the whole time kind of looking at me, so I wasn't even being as dramatic as I thought I was. But as a kid, this was a big deal. Now, as a grown man, I have come to know hardship and sorrow more than being told to wash my hands. But as a 4-year-old, this was my emotional limit. While I maybe wouldn't have described it as sorrow, I certainly viewed the situation as hard enough that I was willing to leave everything and everyone behind. I was done, and I was just going to do things by myself. And that's like a light-hearted story, but how often is it that in tough seasons, when things hurt, when we've been hurt by others, or when life just happens, we can find ourselves drifting away into isolation. And that can sometimes be us. It can be conscious, and we can choose to pull away from people. Or it can be that months go by and we just feel cut off and by ourselves, rather than drawing near to God, drawing near to kind of the destination of home. We pack our bags and we say, I'm done. And I want to know how we get better at that kind of staying close to God in sorrow, staying close to God when actually stuff is really tough. Now, the context of this passage is relational sorrow. Paul and the Corinthian church have just come through this season where they've all kind of hurt each other a bit. But actually, we can feel sorrow in a bunch of different ways in our life. Fallout, loss, disappointment, grief, dreams not being fulfilled. And in sorrow, we can feel that distance, that sense of being unattached, of drifting away. And when the tide turns, we can find this whole church, God, faith thing really tough. That's kind of the main thrust of this passage, that when sorrow in all of its forms hits us, we're presented with a choice. Do we draw nearer to God, to community, to life? Or do we drift away into isolation and regret and death? Our desire can be to seek distance, but instead, we should be actually pulling close in that moment. Thankfully, this passage gives us some helpful advice on how to deal with kind of sorrowful seasons, how to stay close in the moment, and also how to move on from it well when stuff starts to wrap up. So, the passage is telling us a whole bunch of things, and we're going to kind of frame it under make room. So I think a bunch of stuff's going to pop up. There we go. So the passage opens on this great line, make room for us in your heart. Paul and his team are coming back to the church of Corinth at last, after this turbulent season of hurt feelings and upset. And everyone collectively has decided, actually, we're going to put the past behind us. We've resolved what needed resolved, and we're going to move forward into a brighter future. And a reunion is about to happen. And Paul issues them with this slightly odd request, where he says, make room in your hearts for us. I don't know what Christmas or family holidays looks like for you guys, but for me and my family, I know that it is like a descending of way too many people into one house, and we convert every single couch and seating thing into a bed. We get camp beds out, people are sleeping on the floor. We're close to considering getting tents in the back garden kind of thing. It is a tight squeeze, but we find a way to fit everyone in. We don't have family kind of show up at the door and we say, actually, this year we're full, so you're going to need to find some other arrangement. We find a way to make the space. And space in your hearts is kind of an interesting expression to use. We don't really say that in our lives. You'd be a little bit theatrical if you're regularly using that expression. But it suggests that the Corinthians weren't yet making that space in their hearts for Paul. He wasn't maybe feeling sufficiently welcomed, or he was anticipating that there was going to be a weirdness, and there was going to be a sense of we're all a little bit closed off. It's a very human thing the Corinthians are doing. Like, when we're hurt or we're just not having our best day, we do sometimes wrap our hearts up a little bit and we kind of close ourselves down. We don't fully give ourselves to people. We aren't as warm as we should be. We don't love as well as we should. We're not as graceful to each other as we should be. We can snap a little bit quicker because we're hurting, and that makes sense. But we make a mistake in dealing with hardship when we don't make room in our hearts for community and for people and for church, for those around us. When we say, this is mine, I'm just going to do stuff myself. It's a very bad place to put yourself in when you're in a hard season to try and do it by yourself. And Paul is indicating that it is a priority right through life, but specifically in those sorrowful seasons, to make that room for people to be around you, even though you don't want to, and it doesn't make sense to do so. And the call of the Christian is to live big, open lives that welcome others in. Yet our lives don't always model that. At least I know mine certainly doesn't. And in seasons of hurt, they rarely do. We're kind of half versions of ourselves. I think we live in a culture that kind of medicates itself on Netflix and Instagram and the 6 o'clock news and live sport and all this accessible 24/7 stuff that we can just turn to when we feel a little bit withered. And I'm not against any of these things. I love Netflix. There's this series called Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. I don't know if anybody watches it. I watched the entire new season yesterday. I loved it. And I like Instagram. I like being able to see what my friends and family around the world are doing. I kind of like politics. I used to really like it, and I find my relationship with it is a little bit strained now. But I used to really enjoy watching the news. And I love watching football. I think live sport's great. But sometimes our relationship with this stuff is unhealthy, and we actually use it to kind of fill up space in our hearts. We have a tough day, and we come home, and it's like television on, heart and mind off. We say, I've had a tough week, so I'm going to skip church this Sunday. Or, work sucked today, so I'm just not going to go to Connect Group. We kind of mentally and emotionally check ourselves out for a little while. We put a no vacancy sign on our hearts because we want to shut ourselves away for a little bit until we feel healed up by ourselves. And we fill our hearts with that other stuff. Yet Paul is saying, hey, if we're going to be a healthy church, if we've actually really resolved this conflict and not just said we have, then let's set this culture now of being open with each other, being extra open with each other, almost recognizing the hurt, but saying, I love you so much, and I'm going to bring you into my house, and we're going to have dinner, and we're going to do all this stuff like we would have done before. So when you feel hurt, do hospitality. Bring people into your life. Serve others. Go out for dinner with people even though you've had a really bad day. Let's continue to do friendship and community in our church. In sorrow, in hardship, resist that urge to isolate yourself. And don't fill yourself up with distraction or all that other stuff just to keep yourself busy until you feel fine again. Don't numb yourself to feeling stuff. Instead, go the other way. Go in the direction of home and make room in your heart. The next point that's really important is that we make room for God in our situations. I'm not a parent, but I have been a child. And all of us here will have some kind of understanding of that moment where either when you are a child or if you have a child, where you're like running and you trip up and you like scratch your knee on like gravel or something and your whole world ends. You are screaming and you're just like tears and you've never experienced anything as bad in your life and nothing can put an end to the current pain you have because of a slightly scratched knee. And so you run to your parent and they pick you up and you cry into their chest. And the tears don't necessarily stop, but you're safe and you're close to someone who loves you. You've experienced pain, but you've returned to the source of love. And sorrow is hard. There will be a whole heap of people in this room right now who are experiencing sorrow in a bunch of different ways. And I don't want to demean any of that. I don't want to oversimplify your situation. And I don't want to say, hey, if you just read the Bible more or prayed a little bit more, your situation would go like that. We will know sorrow in our lives. We'll have tough seasons. But we have a God who loves us like a parent. God is labeled here as the God who comforts the downcast. And a quick Bible reading tip for you. If it kind of ever titles God as something, it's quite important to pay attention to that. And that whole thing is actually right through the Bible. In Psalm 23, it says, "The Lord is my shepherd. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." God doesn't promise to kind of bypass the valley for us or to take us on a longer route so we don't go through that. But he does promise that he'll be with us. He'll comfort us and restore us, even in the midst of sorrow and hurt and in those valley seasons of life. And for Paul and the Corinthians, they've actually made efforts to kind of patch things up together. They've done a tremendous amount of work in trying to make sure that the problem has been solved and they can move on together. Paul wrote that letter with this kind of sense of hesitation, of like, oof, do I hit send on this? Because this is weighty. But he felt God telling him to do so. But they do know that this season is a bit like a freshly sewn up wound. There's still sensitivity and some healing still actually needs to occur between them. It's not like everything is going to be right immediately again. But they have done their bit now. And now they all stand back and make space for God to heal their hearts, to bring them closer again, to finish that work. So wherever you're at today, whatever sorrow you may be in or facing, or have family members who are in or facing, trust and know that God is with you in that, even though it might not totally feel that way. And know that actually, like, you've turned up today. You're in the room, you're here. You're doing a bunch of the right things by still coming along. Trust that God will actually finish that work. He will get you through that sorrow eventually, and he'll be with you no matter how long it takes. Make room for God in that sadness. And lastly, make room for celebration. Does anyone in the room, or has anyone in the room, worked in like cafes, hotels, shops, bars? A few of you. Can we give a quick round of applause for these people? They're the real heroes of society. I want to burst another bubble today. I have and continue to work in the hospitality industry. You have some days which are just the worst. Like, it is a complete slog. The door opens at 8 o'clock and right up until like 10 at night. It is just horrific. And it's like all of the I want to say this in a loving way, most infuriating people decide, today's the day we're all going to visit your space. We're all going to hang out. And for some reason, they believe they're right. Like, let's burst that bubble. The customer is not always right. Like, 100%. There we go, yeah. I just think the world needs to hear that. We need to move into a different season of how we do the service industry. But those days, it is wall to wall, and it is horrible, and you're like dripping with sweat, and you're kind of angry, and there's just too much going on, and you're not sure that the place isn't going to burn down by the end of the shift. But you get to that kind of latter stage, you're in the final couple of hours, you look around, you see kind of your team members and the other people you're working with, and you think, oh, we've nearly made this through in one piece. And one of my favorite memories of when I've worked in the hospitality industry is, I think I had a really cool boss, because they used to do this thing where at the end of a crazy Saturday, they would go out and do a drinks run, and so they'd bring back like some beers or a bottle of wine or whatever. And it's great because everyone who was working in the final moments of that shift were kind of heavy breathing, completely worn out, barely able to make conversation. But we stand together and we have a drink and we celebrate what we've been through that day. And we think, yes, we made it. We served the customers, we made money, but we survived. And now let's do it all over again tomorrow, kind of thing. But making room for celebration is one of the most important things we can do in tiring seasons or in seasons of sorrow or of hurt, both during it and following on from it. Paul has this kind of buoyant tone right through the letter. He keeps making effort to rejoice, and Titus apparently just won't shut up about how nice the Corinthians are. He keeps going on about it because things are finally pointing in this positive direction again. They're not out of the woods yet, but finally things are heading in the right direction. And as we said at the beginning, in suffering we are presented with this choice of draw close or drift away. And there's a story a bit like that in the Bible, the prodigal son, which is a story of a son who left home. He decided he was going to do it on his own. He left his father, and he went off into the city, and life was going well at first. He was having a good time, but suddenly his circumstances changed, and he found himself kind of at the lowest of the lows with no money and no friends and doing a job he hated. He moved from kind of living the high life to scraping by to survive. And so he thinks, life just can't get any worse than this, so I'm going to go home. And so he decides to return home, and on the road back, he's greeted by his father, who is just running out to welcome him back in with open arms. He gives him this enormous hug, and he throws a huge party for him. And I don't think it should be lost on us that in that story, the son would have been entirely taken aback by that response. He's not thinking he's entitled to a party. The son is expecting to maybe have to go back and be a worker in the family, to kind of be very discreet and kind of ignore what's just happened. He was maybe having ongoing conversations in his head the whole way back, being like, my father's going to be distant and cold and disappointed. There's going to be an awkwardness there. The appropriate response socially in that situation would have been to make that kind of discreet return home, to have quietly slipped back into the life of the family and kind of waited for some other crisis to blow up and then eventually kind of reveal yourself again. But instead, the father throws a party, and immediately, off the back of this heartbreaking situation, he invites the family, the neighbors, the friends to also all stop and celebrate, to stop their activity and be like, yes, let's rejoice at this good moment here. The son was home, but his response wasn't to celebrate, but the father suggests a party to mark that kind of movement away from sorrow again. It was the father's initiative to celebrate, not the son's. And I think heaven has a clearer perspective on how we do this stuff than we do sometimes. We're so tempted to blow past things, seasons that can actually really hurt. once we're done, we can just think, cool, that's it. I'm not going to make a big deal about it anymore. Or stuff that actually does cause us a great deal of grief. When we speak to people about it, we just demean it and we think, it's fine, other people have got bigger struggles. Or we're inclined to feel that relief and block it out of our minds and just be like, it's done. I'm going to get on with my life. And this is true going through suffering as well as at the kind of concluding stages of it. Your suffering, your sorrow, your circumstances might feel small. They might feel not worth celebrating when they're done. But our daily decisions in the midst of suffering, I think that stuff is celebrated by God and celebrated by heaven. That kind of conscious decision to turn back in the direction of home, even though stuff is tricky. I think there is celebration involved in that when it's seen. Choosing to stick with it when stuff is tough. That's worth celebrating. When we're hurt and our response is to turn back to Him rather than run away, I think heaven has a little bit of a party in that moment. And when we're back home too, that's worth celebrating, but it's both things. In sorrow, we should create space for joy as much as possible. And I don't think that has to look big or overly extravagant necessarily. That can just be choosing to enjoy the simple pleasures of life again, even though the day-to-day is still tricky. But I think what a mighty resistance against the hardships of life that can be. Imagine being known as somebody who's just like always celebrating. Party Johnny, just walking into a room, be like, hey, like, it's a good thing. Yet we dial it back too much. So in sorrow, in sadness, in tough seasons, when we've been hurt by people, or when life is tricky, let's have this kind of champagne popping culture. And I don't mean that insensitively at all. Like, I'm not saying cheer up, choose to be happy. But I'm meaning be ready to celebrate. Have that kind of bottle in your fridge where when there's a victory, no matter how small, you're like, hey, we're going to mark that because that's worth marking. When we're in sorrow, don't let that rob us of our ability to experience joy, to enjoy stuff in life. And when we come out of that hard season, don't just brush past it. If it really hurt you, it seems kind of dumb to just pretend that it never did. If you've just come through a period of redundancy, have a bunch of friends around for dinner and celebrate. If you have just patched things up with family and it still kind of hurts, but it's in a better place, run a bath, have a cup of tea, enjoy that. Choose to be like, actually, a celebration's going to occur here. This isn't nothing, this is something. You've had a tough day at work. Go out for a walk in like the evening sun and experience God's goodness. Wherever you're at, in sorrow, at the tail end of it, or just supporting people who are around that, consciously make room to celebrate, even the tiny stuff. Can we maybe like stand as a room, and could the band come up?